everyone. Welcome to the Stoa. Our friend Daniel Schmachtenberger has returned. He was here last week with a really awesome session on the health index. Today the session is called The Psychological Pitfalls of Engaging with X Risks and Civilizational Redesign. I'm super jazzed about this one, and I imagine a lot of people at the Stoa are as well. If you recall, a couple months ago, we had a symposium at the Stoa on the meta crisis. A lot of people came in, talked about X risks, suffering risks, and effective altruism. You know, they talk about kind of burnout from engaging with this type of stuff. We had someone talk about embodiment and X risks. Michael Smith came in. So I imagine a lot of people have a lot of cool thoughts about this. And so how today is going to work, I'm going to take in Daniel in a moment. Daniel will share his thoughts on the topic at hand. And then we'll pivot to Q&A. So if you have any question anytime during the today's session, just put your question in the chat and I'll call on you. You can ask your question to Daniel. If you do not want to be on YouTube, just indicate that and I'll read your question on your behalf. So yeah, I'll take in Daniel now. So feel free to share your thoughts, my friend, and welcome back to the Stoa.
All right. Good to see you, Peter. Good to see everybody. It's fun seeing everybody's face turn on as the music plays. Yeah, this was a topic Peter and I were discussing, and there's nowhere else that I would really share it because it's not even a well-formed set of thoughts. It's just a handful of observations that kind of present themselves maybe as a useful topic for community inquiry and community dialogue. So obviously the nature of broadcast doesn't do dialogue all that well. So I'll be sharing kind of the things that I think are at least seeds for a conversation, and then maybe something will happen in the space if it's interesting to explore it further. Specifically, what motivated it is I've had lots of people reach out to me, some from the Stoa community, others from just kind of watching podcasts in general, talking about the existential risks, catastrophic risks that they have been paying attention to or working on, and the mental illness that has come from them for working in the space, and the extreme difficult interpersonal issues that have come. So like, I just see this a lot. Also, people who are working on it from a psychological disposition that is clearly going to be less than optimal, if not quite problematic. And so there are things I've seen a lot, and I thought it'd be worth talking about. So this is for basically world-saving endeavors in general, anything kind of framed. X risk is a bit unique, like the possibility of Homo sapiens gone, or all hydrocarbon life on Earth gone, or something like that, frames up world-saving in a very unique way. Catastrophic risk in general, even if not full existential risk, the grid shuts down, or massive climate change just disrupting all coastal cities or whatever. It's a unique kind of thing to focus on. But even the topic of how do we make a fundamentally better civil, and what does the future of a high-tech civilization look like? The scale of these things is not really a human scale, right? These are not things that evolutionary history would give us any scale for, or even the history of local civilizations. And getting things wrong because of scale, issues of grandeur, psychologically, issues of overwhelm, having a hard time with your agency matching it. Like, there's just the scale and the consequentiality and the unprecedentedness, and all of those things create for a situation where there'd be a lot of reasons to not be attracted, to want to pay attention to the space. And those who are attracted sometimes have things about them that are strange. And then also engaging with it has interesting effects. So I thought I would just mention a handful of things that I've experienced working in the space, people that I've worked with, and things that I've noticed came up for me as I worked in the space and to pay attention to. By no means will we be doing anything like a comprehensive list. So take these almost more as examples of like the types of ways to think about how psychological dispositions relate to how one comes to a space, and then also the nature of being in a space, how that affects someone, and then how the ongoing kind of process of their psychology affects what they do in the space. But you know, I'll probably cover the tiniest percentage of the total space of things worth looking at here. Before we get into what happens working in X-Risk and civilization design and however one wants to call it. I wanted to start by what are some of the strange psychological dispositions that can attract one to the space that are not ideal that you can watch for. And everybody, everyone can have shadow elements. So you're in a place like the Stoa because you're interested in looking at this. So I'm speaking to people here who I'm assuming are earnest in terms of having a real motivation and earnest about wanting to look at their own proclivities and see how to integrate, heal, upgrade themselves, compensate for things like that. There are obviously some people who come to any space for reasons that are mostly just weaponized. And I'm not speaking to them here, though I might be speaking to you of noticing them. You can imagine why a topic like catastrophic risk or existential risk would be a very interesting one for people who are interested in power of different kinds, more than their desire to really prevent it or serve life. I have a friend who helped set up a lot of the X-Risk community who told me of some of the billionaire class that was donating early on. One in particular, very strategic, said really it's just a recruitment strategy for him. He donates to the space because he knows super smart people are attracted to the space, and then he can recruit them into areas of exponential tech, like in the for-profit section. And so you can see someone signaling their interest for a reason other than what it is. Someone running a kind of military contractor type organization wanting to see what are the best distributed red team scenario planning people can do to then be able to actually win at the arms race rather than try to prevent it. Or just any space that starts getting attention and having some, because of the attention, power associated will always be a honeypot for people that are seeking attention and power and want to signal and ladder climb. So that thing happens. I don't assume that I'm speaking to anyone who's doing that, because there's usually some self-knowledge of that. I'm assuming that I'm speaking to people who have what most of us have all the time, which is that there are different facets of self. And I was just seeing if this comment was saying my connection was bad. No, okay. There are different facets of self that have different motivations for the same thing. It's very common someone will have a motivation to, from a deep part of themselves, to genuinely serve and protect life. Motivation in the cognitive domain to want to learn about interesting and important things. An interpersonal motivation to want to work with good people on an important topic where you feel camaraderie. Some unresolved ego places that want to feel seen and recognized for doing important work. Some unmet needs that need compensated. It's like there's going to be a number of things coming together. So what we're going to look at is some of the ones that can get in the way that are worth noticing. And I think it's worth saying like a conversation like this could be had about any profession. There are psychological dispositions that attract someone to be a police officer or a doctor or a politician or whatever. And then there are psychological effects of working in that space. Obviously, some of those are really important, like how do you attract highly empathetic and compassionate people to the role of a police officer? How do you keep them highly empathetic in the presence of the thing that they're paying attention to and that they're experiencing all the time? Like that's a real issue. What is the effect being a doctor of the malpractice issues and liability issues that you have to deal with to not lose everything and have your family lose everything, and simultaneously the fact that you're overworked radically and don't have time and you're dealing with dead people all the time? And like, so the types of psychological professional hazards and weird attractors in this space are not unique to this space. I just haven't worked as a police officer or a medical doctor. I don't have much to say about those. Those are more established fields, so that there is more kind of known in terms of professional psychological insight and help for the established fields. And specifically, I think the Stoa community, or at least some portion of the Stoa community, is interested specifically in these topics of how do we design a different future and both from the positive side of how do we participate in designing a better future, but also from the negative side of it seems like there are really shitty futures that have high probability. How do we prevent those and design a better future? So insofar as people are paying attention to that and they're here rather than in some other forum because they're both interested in that and interested in their own personal development to be in better service to that, and hopefully also relational development so that they can work together. That's why it seemed relevant. So with all that preface, so if you just think about what types of weird psychological dispositions that might be problematic could attract someone to the space of looking at existential risk and catastrophic risk in the first place, you could probably just start to guess them if you haven't already even noticed them, right? So there's a bunch of things that have to do with fear. Someone's fear of uncertainty and fear of just bad shit happening can of course attract them, but where there can also be distortion because of that fear that has them weight everything through an anxiety lens. And there's this very interesting symbol grounding thing where it's like, if you feel, let's say that I have a bunch of unresolved fears of the unknown because I had a traumatized childhood where at any moment my parents could behave erratically and in messed up ways. And so I just had hypervigilance develop. Well, I now have an embodied sense of anxiety and hypervigilance, not connected to anything, free floating that I've just projected on all. And so things that look negative, like they could go bad, feel true to me because they'll resonate with my existing feelings that have nothing to do with observing reality, but old stuff I haven't resolved. If I see a different scenario where things look possibly secure or good, it won't feel true to me. It won't land as true. I'll be suspicious of it because I don't have those feelings. So there's a place where there is a feeling of truth, no matter how logical someone wants to be, because they can always say, well, that argument looks really logical, but I think we missed something. Where does that I think we missed something come from? It doesn't actually land as feeling true. So I'm going to look at it again versus I hear it initially as a hypothesis. And I'm like, that's the hypothesis I want to go study and see if I can verify because it feels true. So I think people underestimate, no matter how logical they're being, how much the symbol grounding, the embodied feeling ends up being a huge part of it. So fear of the unknown and general fear of uncertainty, making me want to be a forecaster. So I have more certainty about the future, and fear of negative things happening. This is a huge one. And fear of death specifically. And so then I can project my fear of my own death onto the fear of death of everybody. And I'm going to solve my own existential fear of death by solving the death of the world or civilization. I probably don't know that's happening, right? I probably think, no, I'm just being very rational about the fact that AI risk is a very real thing and biotech risk and et cetera. And that might also be true because we're complex creatures with multiple parts operating. But to be both a lot of what's driving and a lot of what creates distortion. This topic of that I just mentioned about like fear of my own death, so let me solve civilization not dying, can also be like fear of chaos. Say in childhood, family felt chaotic and didn't feel like I could solve that. So I'm going to solve chaos in the world. The projection of our own unmet needs that we actually feel low agency over, and they're too traumatic. So we project them in the world and try to solve them is unbelievably common, right? Not in this space alone, in all kinds of spaces. And so this is why the Taoist saying, if you want to protect your feet from rocks, better to get shoes than try to cover the world in leather. All of those sayings around why your own psychotherapeutic healing work is important is because all of you, your knowledge of science, your knowledge of cognitive biases and logical fallacies, and your unresolved traumas and interpersonal issues and fears, all of you will come to bear in how you assess and how you act on the situation. And so as much as you want to develop your cognitive abilities and your knowledge of the technological stack and your knowledge of how to do Bayesian forecasting and other types of good, confidence margin calibrating forecasting, you also want to work on clarifying the grounding and the psychology of it as much as possible. Another thing I've noticed is there's so many people who just really don't think about catastrophes that much at all. They're thinking about positive things. Or if there's negative, oh yeah, I know climate change, whatever, it's a bummer, but their mind doesn't keep gravitating there. Their mind gravitates to what is near term or whatever. There are some people whose mind gravitates to real negative things and gravitates to it so much they can't not try to think about it and figure it out. And then if my mind gravitates towards those things so much that I don't just think about climate change or species extinction or nuclear risk, but all of them, and try to think about X risk as a whole category, there might be a disposition to focusing on the catastrophic that is worth looking at. In CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy, one of the main dispositions that messes people up psychologically that they tell you to look at is what's called catastrophizing, right? And in your own personal relationship, he didn't call me back, it means that he dumped me and is going to die, doesn't love me anymore, whatever. It's like you're just going worst case scenario with some tiny little thing, and it obviously leads to huge amounts of interpersonal stress and anxiety. And I think it was Mark Twain who made the quote, I've suffered a great many terrible things in my life, a few of them actually happened. And the idea that almost the greatly terrible things that I suffered were just shit I made up in my mind but still suffered from. So the disposition to catastrophize, it's quite possible if someone has that disposition, they're smart and they got some analytical skills or whatever, they might actually be quite good at forecasting bad scenarios and be a good risk analyst. Whether we're talking about for a military application or financial risk analyst or X risk analyst, they might be better than most people at being able to think through all the bad shit that could happen, and then how to think through theory and solutions for how to address it. This is actually a good thing of like how a particular trauma can actually have a gift in it. And this is most of the time, our traumas and our gifts are connected, right? Like whatever difficult stuff we went through often sensitizes us to issues that we weren't sensitive to otherwise. Often in the process of healing it, we come up with some skills that are useful for the world. So this is very common, but it's also true that if we don't heal the trauma, the lingering trauma messes up the gift. We might have a really awesome gift, but it continues to have dysfunction and self-sabotage and whatever associated. And so we want to take the gifts from whatever bad conditioning or trauma we had and heal it enough that we're not still suffering with the trauma, but have the gift. So let's say I have a disposition to catastrophize. As a result, I can red team the shit out of your project. Tell you that 700 different ways that it can fail from nth order effects. That's quite helpful to think through so that I don't have to actually fail from all of those things, you know, like being able to anticipate them, put some probabilities on them, see how we would test that. That's quite helpful. The question then is, let's say, in order to achieve any big thing, like, okay, how do we create protection against weaponized drone attacks on infrastructure? I can't do that by myself. It's going to take a team to do that. It's a hard damn thing to do. How are we going to harden the electrical grid against EMPs and Carrington events? How are we going to create a closed loop materials economy that addresses planetary boundaries? I have to work with a big team very well to do that. Now, does that same catastrophizing have me catastrophize my relationships where I can't trust anybody? Because I assume that everyone else is either going to make the wrong decisions because they don't understand everything as well as I do, or they're actually badly motivated. Well, seeing where people are badly motivated is a huge part of doing X risk well, right? Being able to see the game theory and being able to see where people cause problems by accident, which is externalities, unintended externalities. So if I'm really good at seeing the game theory and the externalities, can I also not apply that when that's the wrong tool? I'm like amazing at swinging hammers, but now it's time to cut shit and I'm still swinging hammers. So the best tool is actually totally destructive when it's not time to use that tool. And if it is a tool that becomes a disposition, right? So if you want to do really hard work of this type with lots of people, you have to be able to develop very high trust relationships. So then there's a question of, do you have capacity to do very high trust relationships? That and catastrophizing don't work together well. Also, there's no solving X risk that is that means anything without being an optimist in some way. Like, there's a kind of pessimism I need to think through all the problems, but there's a kind of optimism I need to think that could be a constructive pursuit at all, and that we could actually solve them. And that when I look at the overwhelming face of all the shit, that I think about how to actually overcome it. And it's almost like there's an optimism that is a choice that says, I'm going to look for solutions, period. Maybe I fail, maybe I die looking for it, but I'm not going to move into the compromise. I'm not going to ask, are there solutions or not? It's a wrong fucking question. I might get a bad answer to it. I'm going to say, what would it take to solve this? Let me understand the design criteria enough. What would it take to solve it? And then, so I'm committed to find solutions and not get stuck. But since I want them to be good solutions that I can believe in as a post-naive optimist, not a naive optimist, right? I go from a naive optimist to a cynical pessimist to a post-naive and post-cynical optimist, right? You have to get to the post-cynical phase. That's critical. So I want my optimism to be a post-cynical choice, that I'm going to keep looking for adequate solutions, and ultimately that I trust in the bigness of the unknown possibility space, that there might be shit I just haven't thought of yet. So I'm not going to come to the certainty there are no solutions. False certainty about negative stuff is one of the biggest problems, right? The holy wars were all fought over people's certainty, right thing. Nobody really does great acts of atrocity in uncertainty. So if you have to decide which side to err, it's I'm certain there are no solutions. Okay, well then we just have to radically depopulate because that's the only thing. Or I'm certain that AI is going to take over. Okay, so we have to figure out how to upload our consciousness to the cloud. So we're going to justify some really fucked up experiments for a while, or how to, whatever it is. So you can see how when somebody has a false certainty because they couldn't possibly know the whole possibility space of stuff that's in the unknown, and yet they preclude there could be no possibility there, then they start looking at bad possibilities. So there's this post-cynical optimism that then uses cynical pessimism to red team the solutions to make them better, right? Not to throw them out, but to make them better. And so I'm going to come up with why they might not work so that I can come up with solutions to solve that. So if somebody is in the naive place that doesn't recognize how fucking hard these issues are and how much actual game theoretic nonsense is there, even in the space of people supposedly working on this and et cetera, you're just going to fail and you'll move to this next space soon. If one is in the cynical place, there are real upper bounds on the kind of trust creation and the kind of design solutioning you can really do. So there is a post-cynical place one must be in. To be post-cynical authentically, you have to know that there are other people who are post-cynical. Because if you're cynical, you think trust is impossible. Trust is something that naive people do, right? You think the way Machiavelli would talk about it. And so you think, oh, whoever I trust the most is who I get fucked the most by. So whoever doesn't know who the sucker in the room is the sucker. There is a kind of trust that is post-cynical where everybody knows game theory because they're like, whether it was this or not, I'll use it as an example, right? We can see the way the Cathars all decided to die together in service of this thing. We can see the way the founding fathers, when they're writing the Declaration of Independence and signing their name, no, they're all signing to be killed if the British catch them in terms of sedition, which also means they're signing to be killed if any of the other guys defect. So what they're doing is saying, I trust you enough that I trust you under duress to not defect on this kind of thing. So any decent rebel alliance or fellowship of the ring or whatever has to be post-cynically grounded in a way where there is a transcendent loyalty to the cause that we know each other share, which makes a transcendent loyalty to each other. And so you can't catastrophize your relationships, right? You can't bring trauma into those relationships and have that thing work. You obviously have to not be stupid. You have to use really good discernment, but good discernment means not projecting old patterns. It means clear of old patterns, actual discernment. I might want to come to the space of X risk, catastrophic risk, or even just I'm going to solve SDGs or whatever kind of world saving proposition just purely for the ego reason if it sounds like the dopest thing to do. Like, what are you working on? Oh, you're working on a local homeless shelter. That's cute. I'm actually going to save the world. You're solving cancer. I'm solving the ability for anyone to ever solve anything ever again, because otherwise it's not going to be able to happen, right? So if I just want to one-upmanship my way all the way to the top, I'm solving the world. And so you just have to check that shit, right? Like, ego has a role in life. We have individuated senses of self. It has a role. If one doesn't have transcendent experiences of connectedness to everything that are not mediated through words and mediated through their name and mediated through being a human with a gender and a language, if you don't have a transcendent experience of that type that includes but transcends the ego, you need to work on that, because you can't actually do the right kind of work only from the ego place. Ultimately, without this biosphere, I'm nothing at all. So but my ego doesn't include the biosphere. Hey, what's in it for me? How do I get ahead? Whatever. And yet I don't fucking exist without all the stuff that I depend upon that isn't included in my little sense of self, which means I can harm things that I depend upon in service of this little myopic thing. And so one needs to have a sense of life, the interconnectivity of all of it that's actually embodied. This is the purpose of any kind of mystical, spiritual. It doesn't require weird beliefs. It's actually not about beliefs at all. Beliefs mess it up. It's about experience of consciousness not mediated through the semantic, and a transcendent connectivity associated with that. You can have that without any beliefs. You'll still come back to having an ego, come out of that most transcendent experience, whether it's through meditation, vision questing, ayahuasca, whatever, and then you'll still have an ego. And so any model that shames the ego and says it's a bad thing we need to get rid of just puts us at eternal conflict with ourself, because it's a dimension of ourself. The ego is, the mind is, the emotions are. So they all have an evolutionary purpose. It's just how do we tend to them and integrate them? So a healthy ego doesn't fuck the whole for itself, right? It actually subordinates to higher self. That's an important thing. And then insofar as the ego wants belonging and wants esteem and those types of things, it wants it from things that are actually aligned with its highest values and aligned with long-term interest rather than short-term interest. So it's not hypernormal stimuli. So if there's a part of me that wants recognition, it would be better to think about things like, what will I feel best that I had spent my life on my deathbed? And how do I want the people who are gathered when I'm dead thinking about me, about who I was as a person and who I was to them and how I interacted, how I touched them, and those types of things? That's still ego motive. It's just an ego motive that, because it is relational and because it has more duration, ends up being less problematic than just visualizing myself getting the Nobel Prize or whatever the nearer term, less holistic consideration is. So you can watch, like, a way you can tell this isn't happening. So like, let's say I'm focused on X risk. I want people to be nurses. Like, there are people who are going through existential risk themselves this moment. They're in the process of dying or about to die, or their kid is, right? And it's like, it's everything that is sacred about the big picture in a microcosm embodied now. And I can't help that, but that nurse can, or that person who's doing rescue work with dogs in the pound or the whatever it is. Like, I want everyone bringing that full depth of love to whatever is theirs to do. So I can tell if I'm in a conversation with someone, do I listen to the thing they're into and get fascinated by it and get proud about it and get wrapped and want to support it and not need to talk about my thing? Do I talk about my thing in a way that actually makes what they're doing possibly seem less important even to them? If so, that's an asshole thing I got to fix. There's a million things like this. It's kind of, if I have big control issues, I might be very interested in designing the future because I want to feel like I have control in the biggest possible thing I could want to have control in. I want to feel like I can bend the world to my will, or whatever it is. It very much Alexander the Great, Napoleon, conqueror kind of mentality applied in this domain. It's like there's a lot to be very concerned about in those spaces. So these are a few things about dispositions, egoic dispositions, trust dispositions, fear dispositions, that catastrophizing ones that might attract us to the space, but might also mess up how we show up there. And so what we would do is say, how do I inventory these and how do I work on them? What therapists can I work with? What practices can I do? And also, who can I be in close relationship with that I can trust, where they can help check me on this shit? And I ask for that, and I can help check them on stuff. So can we, because the definition of a blind spot is I can't see it. So there's going to be stuff in the way that I'm showing up where I think that I showed up pretty well, and they're like, no, you totally seemed like an arrogant asshole, or no, you seemed really disconnected and way more interested in your own stuff than anyone else. I'm like, I didn't know. And so I need people that I trust to give me feedback, and I need to want to hear it, and I need to make it really safe for them to give me that. I won't always agree. It might be some of their trigger. I should take it really seriously and err on the side of trying to agree and trying it on. We can get now into the topic of what happens working in the space of having all of your attention on very abstract things, very long-term things, and all the particularly most negative things. But I guess I'll stop here and say, are there any questions or thoughts at this point on the attractors to the space topic?
Yeah, that's a lot of good stuff here, and we got tons of questions coming up. So let me just take a moment to feel into what is the best one to start off with. Yuli, if you can be taken first.
Hi, thank you. So which of my questions, you're talking about the which organizations question, very last one?
Whatever ones feels alive for you.
Okay, I think the most alive one is actually, so from tiny bit of context, I think there's not a single thing you mentioned that doesn't apply to me. So I work in the effective altruism space, and when I hear these predispositions, I think about how they're constantly showing up. And it was very difficult for me personally to inventory them properly and to see exactly how much work I should be doing on improving the various elements that I'm noticing. Because again, I'm sort of like balancing a whole bunch of stuff. So maybe the question could start with like, how do you recommend we effectively inventory? And I know you touched this in terms of like building high trust relationships for people to point out the blind spots. But if there's other easy access tools, I think that would be really useful for me to hear about.
Yeah.
And then any deeper part of the question might be something like, there's basically infinite personal growth on some level. So any thoughts you can talk about how to synergistically navigate the balance between self-improvement and application of that which we have to offer would be really appreciated.
Yeah, this is awesome reflection. So how you inventory, other than asking other people, stuff you can do on your own, take frameworks, take Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And in each of those, say, what stuff feels insecure or unmet for me there? And how does that show up in my disposition? Where do I have unmet stuff around belonging or around esteem or around feeling self-actualized, around feeling secure? And then just say, where does that actually affect my motivational complex that if that was addressed would be different? Where does that become a hook of different kinds? And so it's an example of a framework you can apply. You can apply the 7 deadly sins, honestly, and say, okay, so where is pride? Where is greed? Where is, various things like that coming in? And just as a framework, you can take chakras, and the chakra system as a metaphorical system for types of emotion, thought, and capacity is a good system. So I can explain that one later. It actually would take a while to explain all of them, but if it's a familiar one for you. So just take frameworks that look at the dimensions of a person, right? The dimensions of a self, and do an inquiry around it. That's one way. Another way, notice where your stress is and inquire into what the internal dispositions are that create that stress, not the external circumstances. But so very much in a Byron Katie way, if you aren't familiar with that work, CBT or whatever. So get the book Loving What Is by Byron Katie and watch a few of her videos. It's a simplified method of CBT, but that's actually quite good, that looks at, if you want a more erudite version, start with Krishnamurti's writings on the topic, but he doesn't give you a very practical thing. He just shows you how much what you're observing is the combination of observation and narrative, the evaluation or narrative continuously, and it's happening so fast and subtly that you don't even realize you're narratizing shit and you think that it's objective observation. And which is why he said one of the highest stages of human intelligence is to observe with no evaluation, which is really fucking hard. So you can take that and then be able to say, okay, because 4 different people might be in a very similar circumstance and have very different emotional results. One of them gets angry, one of them gets sad, one feels scared, one feels ashamed, one feels excited, one feels proud, based on the meaning making. So the exploration of human meaning making, narratizing events, and then our emotions responding to the meaning making is huge. It's like probably the area, the biggest lift you can get of any area to work on first has to do with noticing the patterns of meaning making and shifting them, realizing that you actually have agentic process over it. I think Byron Katie's work is the work that kind of made that simplest pragmatically for people. So wherever you're feeling stressed about something, you're having mistrust in relationships with people, you're feeling overly pessimistic, you're feeling overly concerned about all the things that exist in the unknown, then you can just look at what are the core beliefs underneath that, because the stress I'm having with this person feels a lot like 100 situations I've had in the past like this, right? This concern about the unknown now in biorisk is a lot like what it felt like when I was doing nuclear risk or whatever the fuck else it was. And so it's like, okay, it's not really about the topic, it's about the way I'm relating to the topic. So what is the underlying generative unconscious belief that is that is a generator function of narrative here? And it's something like, I can't trust anybody, or in order to be safe, I need to know what's going to happen. In order to be safe, I need control, or whatever, right? Like these kinds of things. So you just notice where's the stress, and then you notice what is the narrative that the video camera can't see, because it's me narrating the fucking what the video camera sees. The video camera is doing third person. I'm doing a second person thing on it, right? And then what is the generative belief that would have me narrate it that way and narrate 1,000 other videos in related ways? Then how do I work on that belief? That's another way. Another way is you look at where you have had the greatest failures and blockages in your work, including the ones that you blame on everybody else. I'm not saying you do, I'm saying one. And try the experiment of, if I take 100% responsibility for that failure, even if it was other people were such and such, why did I not have better discernment about that, better structuring of it, better whatever it was? Because otherwise what I'm saying is I have learned nothing and I'm completely unempowered, and like feeling scared about the world or disappointed about it or resentful of them is all I got. And so if I would go through something, I want to say, could I go through it again differently and better? Well, I only can if I learn something I could do differently. So look at the areas where you've had the most challenge, the least success, the most disappointment, and say, if I take 100% responsibility for it, what are the patterns in how I showed up that contributed to it going that way? That if I did it differently, maybe the people would have behaved differently. Maybe I would have behaved differently to them. Maybe I would have picked different people. Maybe I would have, whatever, right? when you say there's an infinite amount of areas for personal growth, starting with wherever the failures are biggest, taking responsibility that the failures have more to do with your psychology than one thinks. I think failures have a fuck ton to do with the psychology of the person going in, where the same skills and capacities they have with a different psychological disposition could be applied much more effectively. And starting with, how do I work on the psychological dispositions that I can identify as having a at least partial causal relationship to where I get stuck the most? That's a very good way to like focus on where you're going to get the most leverage out of the work. And then there's a thing around having experiences where you really have a sense of, I am not my current identity. I'm more of the transformative process, because there's some continuity of self from when I was 5 and 15 and 25 and now, and I'm a totally different person. I went from being a liberal to a conservative to a trans-political. I went from having views on this to this. I changed my religion. I changed what the fuck am I that is different than all these beliefs, different than these skills and capacities? Right now, I'm super identified with this role and these capacities, but I was identified with other shit before I'd ever thought of any of this stuff. And so if you realize in 10 years, I might have totally different capacities, hopefully do, totally different dispositions, etc. So more than my current state, the process that is seeking to evolve, that is seeking to grow and become, and that is also specifically seeking to take responsibility for failings and areas of weakness and heal them, means I'm not that area of weakness. I am whatever kind of deeper care and love is willing to integrate and shift that. And I'm not my current skill set. I'm whatever deeper kind of value and love will develop new skills that are useful wherever it is to be of greatest service. So if you take that on seriously, then you welcome criticism about where you are currently, because it's not actually criticizing the essence of you. It's criticizing a particular developmental state that you won't continue to be, but you will only get to transcend it if you see it. And so then there's this place where it's like, I can look compassionately, statement like, oh, wow, I didn't realize I was doing that. That makes perfect sense. Do you have any guidance on how I might fix that? I just asked Peter the other day for guidance on, Peter and I were talking, and I said, are there any ways that I've showed up in the Stoa that suck, that seem like they're not that great or helpful? And particularly, there was a conversation where somebody said something to the effect of that I mansplained something to them, and I'm like, do I do that? And it was interesting because I'm like, sometimes I get criticized for saying things that seem too obvious and people already know, and they're like, come on, give me some fucking credit. But even more often, I get criticized for using terms and phrases people don't know and assuming they do know the shit, and being like, dude, you have to explain the stuff more. And I'm like, I don't know how to calibrate. And I need some help here. So I asked Peter, and he's like, well, if you're going to explain some stuff that maybe people know, but you aren't sure if they know, and it is still helpful to clarify because you want to make sure you're on the same page, just preface it every time and say, this is shit you probably already know, but I just want to double check. Sometimes I do that, but after we had that talk, I will do it more now. And so, but I reached out and asked him, right? And continued to kind of ask until getting an insight on it. So this is a real valuable thing, is finding people who you are asking to give you feedback. It's kind of like a guy who doesn't want his partner to give him any feedback on what she likes in bed because his fragile ego wants to already think he's a great lover is actually going to be a shitty lover. And a guy who's like actually seeking feedback will become a much better lover. And so there's this self-fulfilling prophecy either way. If I want to be seen as good, I'll actually be worse. If I want to be actually good, I want to know where I'm not, right? So there's this just like really seek the input. And the last thing I think I can say on this is there was this video that I watched It was so beautiful. I watched it a little while ago, a couple times. I cried both times. I think it was Leo Szilard, as an old man, like a 90-year-old man, being interviewed about the early quantum mechanics days and all of the founders of modern physics and what it was like. And there was an affection with which he was speaking about von Neumann and Einstein that was just super touching. And the guy asked him, the interviewer said, who was the smartest of all the people doing modern physics? And he's like, no question, it was Johnny von Neumann. Everybody knew it was Johnny von Neumann. Clock speed, no comparison. And none of us were even tripping about it because there were no close seconds. And he kind of went on about how great he thought Johnny von Neumann was. Then the interviewer said, so does that mean that his contributions were the deepest? And then Szilard sat back and he said, no, that would be Mr. Einstein. And he got teared up and he's like, there was something other than clock speed that Einstein was doing that made his insights go profoundly deeper. And he's like, I didn't know what he was doing at the time. And I've started to get a sense of it. And even Johnny knew that. And this is all of Einstein's quotes about intuition and creativity more than just intellect and those types of things. And that it's an optical delusion of consciousness to believe there are separate things. There is in reality one thing we call universe. And like there was a mystical, but really a set of psychological dispositions that took time, right? It took time of him wondering what it was like to be light in a very deep way, trying to get a first person sense of what it was like to be a photon and trying to get a sense of, I want to know God's thoughts, the rest is trivia. He took a lot of time in something that didn't seem all that useful in terms of chalkboard physics that also gave him deeper insight. So I would say the psychological work that you do, if it brings you into greater wholeness, the ultimate nature of reality is that all of the reductionism is useful and false. It requires us trying to make models of reality that aren't reality, that are useful, but they aren't actually it. And all of the X risk is actually driven in the way Bohm talked about by a fragmented worldview that optimizes parts at the expense of other parts, whether it's the rivalry of China at the expense of the US or vice versa, or this metric at the expense of this metric driving externality. There is a wholeness that has to become the psychological disposition if we are to make it through the amount of tech power that we get. And so any of the places that have unwholeness in ourself are actually like the work there makes us a citizen of the future. And if we aren't a citizen of the future, we can't help build it.
I very, very, very much appreciate all of that. I'll quickly reflect that I'm like noticing a ton of super useful things, even in this moment, right? Talking about the relationship between how I am seeking more certainty, how that's actually feeding into the narratives I'm playing out in terms of like, yeah, I spent a bunch of time at a Buddhist monastery and then I'm out here, you know, sort of taking more action. I'm like, how do I even bridge that? Why do I flip-flop between the two? Why aren't they finding synthesis? What is that? How do I navigate that? So there's a lot of beauty here. I also see there's a lot of really good stuff in the chat. So
How old are you?
I'm 29.
Okay. So I was still in what felt like flip-flopping between those things at 29, and it was somewhere in 30s that it felt like they braided. Mm-hmm. And the flip-flop for me was like three things. There was the personal development part, which both looked like monastic impulses and monastic ventures at different times, but also a lot of psychological work. And that was my primary focus at certain times. There was the study of how do I understand what's going on in the world, and that was science, philosophy, economics, whatever, to know how to work on it. And then there was, fuck, I actually have to help stuff now. There's really critical shit going on. And so there was an activist impulse. And the activist impulse was also critical because if you don't get real, well, one, if you can stay not helping, there's something wrong. If you stay fully in abstraction. And in the actual work, you get so much grounding about what it takes to organize people. I forget who it was. I think it was von Clausewitz, some quote about, you think you're a really great general, try organizing a beach trip of 100 people and just see how hard it is to organize people for a really basic fucking thing. And so in trying to do like even small scale 100-person activism to help a forest, you learn a lot that is relevant to the most abstract scale. So those three And it drove me fucking crazy because I'm like, this needs all my attention. And I always felt the stress of there's not enough time because I can't do the right activism if I don't understand these things, but I also can't do it if I have the wrong psychological dispositions and aren't coming for enough clarity. But I have to help the stuff that's currently happening. And with the stuff that's happening, do I focus on the animals or the environment or the poor kids and it was when I finally recognized that the wholeness of reality is the basis. It is both my own connection to the wholeness. It's my cognitive respect for that wholeness that seeks to understand it as best I can, knowing it'll always be inadequate. And it's that same impulse that has me want to serve life in all the different forms. And that those are actually not competing with each other for time. They're in a virtuous cycle, that the development in each of those areas develops the other ones. And when you hold it as they're in a virtuous cycle, it helps.
Looking very much forward to more of that practice. Thank you, Daniel.
Awesome. Thanks, Yuli. And it's funny, Yuli and a bunch of people Yuli's from Toronto and a bunch of people from the Effective Altruist movement, they went to the monastic academy to stay there for a bit. So perhaps you can come to the Stoa, Yuli, and we can talk about the intersection of what you learned there. Skylar Brown, you had a question on embodiment. I think that'd be a good follow-up.
Hi, Daniel.
Hi, good to see you.
It's so good to see you. Yeah, so the question arose earlier. You were talking about embodiment, and it brought me to a question about intuition. And you and I have talked about this before, and I wondered if you could offer some, from your perspective, the use of intuition or right relationship to intuition, and then pitfalls. And then it came up again when you were speaking about Einstein. It was such a beautiful, I was very touched by that story. Really touched by that story. And it made me curious, in a way, what was Einstein doing? Yeah, that's my question. And I think, let me just add this little piece in case it comes up. There's something about the non-linear ways of knowing that, whether it's intuition or dreams or whatever Einstein was doing, I would love to just hear a little bit about that.
I don't know, Peter, if you've had Ian McGilchrist on if he'd be great to have come on, Master and his Emissary, and talk about the work he's done in deeper understanding of right hemisphere, left hemisphere, the functions they have, the relationship between them. Yeah. It's directly related and probably the best work on the topic I'm aware of.
Can I just, Daniel, let me just say, it's so funny because I just wrote down right brain. Reggie Ray, he talks about the somatic eye, and he's calling the somatic eye is a combination of the heart, the nervous system, and right brain. And I've read that book, but amazing. Mm-hmm. Your intuition was spot on right there.
Mm-hmm. We could easily do a whole Stoa conversation around what is intuition. How does one develop it? What is its relationship with rationality? Is there a distinction between intuition and instinct? Where can they be trusted? Where can they not? Like, there's a whole lot here. And I guess what I'll say briefly is that I think of intuition mostly, I'm not going to say 100%, I think of it mostly as a epistemic capacity that can be developed. In the same way that I think of rationality as an epistemic capacity that can be developed. And everyone does rationality, but they don't all do it well because they didn't develop it. They didn't learn to think about what are my axioms, what is the basis for those axioms, what are my logical steps, and is this something where induction is appropriate, where abduction is appropriate, logical fallacies, critical thinking, etc. So when someone is training science and they're training math, they're training formal logic, they're training rationality to work well. And it takes a shit ton of training because there's a lot of places where it can go wrong. I think it is possible to train intuition, but it's a totally different set of trainings. And I think just like most people's rationality has them rationalize a bunch of nonsense, I think most people's intuition is very largely their unresolved biases magicking themselves up. And so it's a lot of like fear, desire, and preconditioning saying, I have a sense of that. And the sense is just a projection of unresolved stuff. And that leads one to catastrophize if they had, hypervigilance creating childhood and say, hey, my intuition tells me something's bad here. Well, your intuition is shit because you have a bunch of unresolved stuff you're projecting onto every situation. And so, but does that mean you should gaslight yourself and not listen to your intuition ever? Because that ends up being where you get into trouble when you really had a sense of something. Well, this is why you have to develop it, right? One of the main ways you develop the intuition is by clearing the unresolved, unmet needs that create a desire and the unresolved traumas that create fears that make you not actually quiet enough and that make you project past situations and unresolved stuff onto this, that you can actually connect to what's going on currently, right? Like that's a huge part of it. So I think the more trauma healing that happens and the more meeting of needs, so there's less unresolved need, the better one's intuition becomes. That's oversimplified. What was happening with Einstein? I have a big pet peeve around anytime someone takes a phenomena and then tries to explain in words that sound sciencey what's probably happening neurologically or whatever, where it's not actually science. We didn't actually do something to verify that as a theory. It's a hypothesis, and then it's being presented with excessive certainty. So I'm going to give you a hypothesis of what might have been happening, and it might be mechanistically totally wrong. So let's say that the left brain, left hemisphere, and this might not even relate to the left hemisphere all that much, right? It might relate to some other neural networks or other shit. So like I said, mechanistically, this might be wrong. So take this as a reasonable sounding model. Say that the left hemisphere corresponding to rationality more orients itself in the nature of the neural networks to serial process more than parallel process. And so our conscious mind can think through things in a kind of linear way. So I have this data, these are my axioms, this is how I do logical transforms, these are my conclusions. You can give me new input and I can come up with new conclusions, right? And so it lends itself to that. Let's say the right brain has a different type of neural network orientation that lends itself to parallel process more. The parallel process isn't a sequence of thoughts that are happening simultaneously, it's a pattern analysis process of, okay, I have a thing here and I'm holding it up in an other than conscious process to all of my previous experience to see where does a pattern arise. And so then I get a aha kind of out of nowhere because of a parallel processing type dynamic. And so intuition often arises as an aha out of nowhere that we could think of as a kind of pattern matching, which is why people's intuition tends to be better in spaces that they know more. And there was a talk I watched where the Dalai Lama and Eckhart Tolle were speaking about this, and I thought it was quite good. And they were giving an example to the effect of neither of us, when we go into the power of now or Kaivalya or whatever you want to call it, come out with the equations Einstein would come out with. Why? Is it because if we're just accessing the Akashic records and it's all there, we should be able to ask the Dalai Lama what the cure for cancer is, or the solution to the bad guy's nuclear codes, or the solution to unified field theories. We come out with it, except that doesn't happen. The guy who goes in with physics comes out with physics. The guy who goes in thinking about how to solve this suffering of sentient beings comes out with better insights about that. The person who goes in as a very good athlete comes out more in the zone and does better athletics. Eckhart said something like, I'm not going to kick the soccer ball well from the power of now or out of the power of now or whatever, but the really good soccer player, if they access that, does a better job, because what they're accessing is increased wholeness that is taking what's already in them and processing it differently. And so it's making more connections within the self. And I think that is, I don't want to constrain it to say that's the only phenomena, that there is no non-local, whatever kind of phenomena, but I think that's the main way to think, the best way to think about most of it, which is most of the ahas are recombining thoughts and insights and experience I already had with new patterns and insights that I wasn't aware of that wouldn't come through just linear process. They come from a different kind of state that can do a different kind of parallel process. And then that insight I don't take automatically as a verified truth. Now that enters into a left brain process that says, how do we verify that? And then I take the insights from the left brain process, put them into a state where I can see new patterns. So the Einstein process of work on the whiteboard on the math until he got to a block and there was no more real progress happening, and then go puff his pipe, look at the clouds and have some meditative process. And then aha would come, go back to the whiteboard. Then he'd get to diminishing return, go back there. That's exactly this kind of flow between a serial and a parallel type process, between a analytic and a synthetic, right? Analyzing, looking at the parts, how they fit together, synthesizing, looking for deeper patterns that connect it all. But those happen through different modes of mind. So we need to condition, or modes of self, need to condition those different modes. A million more things we could say, but hopefully that is something.
Thank you.
Awesome. Thanks, Skylar. Danielle, you're good for another 20 minutes? Yeah.
Did we mention briefly the risks, not the psychological dispositions of coming to the space, but what happens working in the space?
Yeah. I
won't take long with it. I'll just highlight it, and it's probably obvious. See, this is me applying what Peter taught me last time. It's probably obvious to think about, all right, if I'm a police officer where I'm just focused on areas of high criminal behavior, I'm not seeing the whole of the human condition with an equal distribution, right? And is that going to affect my psyche in certain ways? And how would I compensate for that? Well, if I'm focused on, let me look at all the data of everything that's getting worse. Let me continuously look at all the data of everything that's getting worse. And let me forecast all the ways that humanity could destroy itself and blow itself up. And also let's look at all the ways that we aren't doing a good job of solving it. What's the psychological effect of that? Especially when you're trying to do forecasting and you start to see things that look like timelines. Oh, we only have X amount of time before a runaway effect on climate change occurs. Or we only have X amount of time before autopoietic AGI occurs, or whatever it is. That can create a sense of urgency combined with maximum theoretical consequentiality, combined with a need for and also low agency that can make someone crazy, can make them desperate, make good things. I have seen all of this. It can have someone, in order to stay kind of and look at everything in a very detached way and actually kind of disconnect their emotional self. Like, oh yeah, in this scenario, it's actually not really existential because only 2 billion people die. And maybe actually the 2 billion people dying version is what makes us last long-term because there's a population problem. And so to not be destroyed by it, become sociopathically disconnected. Well, that's a problem. To not be sociopathically disconnected, if I'm really sensitive, how the fuck do I handle thinking about it, right? And not just be crushed. Question of how do I develop sensitivity and strength, resilience at the same time? The strength, not numbness, but the capacity to feel that and hold a wholeness of self in the presence of it. And that is, again, psychological or spiritual, whatever you want to call it, work to do, cognitive, it's all those dimensions. You're working with looking at risks where the more people would know about the risks, they could actually possibly make it worse. The topic of info hazard. So you have to not share certain stuff. So you start getting into domains where you're thinking about why it's important to not be honest all the time. That can start to have very weird effects. It can also start to, particularly if you look at the dispositions, there are some people who just really like to feel like they're on the inside of cloak and dagger shit. Like we know special stuff that's going on and other people don't know. And like there's some ego appeal to that. You can tell if someone knows info that they really think is safe not to share, they usually won't even say that, right? But if they're like, oh, that's an info hazard, there's some mystique that gets made about them to even say that thing. That's actually less good for classifying the information. So, you know, there's weird stuff that happens whenever you're working with the topic of things that are important, but where you're looking at the rational risk of not being honest. And all I would say is like, just be aware of it. And there must be some people inside of circles of trust you can be honest with. And you must also kind of just watch how is this affecting how I show up with people and in relationships? Is the justifying when not to be honest bleeding over into other areas where it shouldn't bleed over? Myopia is one of the biggest ones because it's hard to keep in awareness the rest of the universe that I'm not paying attention to when I'm paying such acute attention to one part. So I will weight those parts heavier than they are. So it's very easy to become certain that we're about to be destroyed. It's already too late because I'm not also looking at positive futures. I'm not also looking at progress that makes things possibly better. I'm not looking at where surprises occur when people were like, oh, there's no way we could beat the speed of sound, or we could this or whatever it was, or create lift, and it happens. And so just the preponderance of data in my attention will affect how I feel. All I have to do is go to a YouTube page that is curated videos of police violence, and particularly say police violence towards people of color, and just scroll the page for half an hour, and I'm fucking and outraged and like horrified just because of the preponderance of stuff coming in. It feels like the most catastrophic thing in the world. Then I can go to a page that is curated of police taking kittens out of trees and going into burning buildings to help people and whatever. And it's amazing how much I know this shit, right? And my emotions change with just a preponderance of a particular kind of sensory input. That's just a half hour of videos, and I know the stuff. So what happens about like if I'm working in the space all the time, how do I also stay connected to positive futures, positive possibilities, beauty of life now, where I'm not trying to save the world, I'm actually in service to the beauty of the world. It's a very different thing. So there's a lot more things like this, but you can just recognize how susceptible we are as people to being over-focused on some areas and not all of them, to thinking about risks that are so huge and that matter so much, but that we can't actually take full agency for. How hard it is to emotionally care and not feel like you can solve it, and the problems of both getting just crushed or emotionally disconnecting. And just being aware of these things and be like, okay, so it's hard. So that's something to work on. So how do I work on it authentically?
And I think that would set up Evan's, Davison Cutler's question. Just to preface it, Evan and I have been talking a lot about the meta crisis and how kind of the Stoa is uniquely positioned, because we're at the intersection of like basically all three of the epistemics are at play at the Stoa. Not only we're talking about the existential risk and suffering risk, but we're talking about embodiment and doing all this kind of shadow work and stuff here. So yeah, I'll let Evan ask his question because it's related.
Yeah, thanks, Peter, and thanks, Daniel, for coming on today. This has been great so far. Yeah, just briefly, Peter outlined the beginning of it quite nicely, but the Stoa is in quite a unique position, given those three modalities, to be, I think, quite impactful here. And it's been experimenting with quite a lot of different psychotechnologies, as well as sort of developing its own sort of ecology of practice and various psychotechnologies. And so I'm wondering if there's anything that stands out to you in terms of how the Stoa could be best deployed to culture a ecology of practices or develop a sort of psychotechnology toolkit in the space that would assist individuals who are working on X risk.
Very interesting question. I mean, I think the first thing I can say is I like the idea of it doing that. I also agree that it's in a good position to do that. It would probably actually be worth doing a small design call to see for the people who have good thoughts on that to come together and contribute ideas. I think that would be a valuable thing, so that the collective intelligence of the Stoa community gets to help create the answer to that. Couple thoughts. I would have to think about it longer, but a couple thoughts that come to mind right away. We did a talk here one time on this set of questions I wrote called Dharma Inquiry. You can, if you search the Stoa YouTube, you'll see it, and there's a link to the questions, and they're questions designed to help someone feel into what they care about most, what their kind of positions are, what might be different if they felt more capacitated, and towards like what does look like for them. I think right path doesn't look like directly focusing abstract topic X risk for almost anyone. There's very few people where the right path is to focus on the abstract topic of X risk. For some people, focusing on a specific X risk, like cybersecurity attacks on infrastructure, like that by itself needs tens of thousands of people focused on it who have real skills. And someone might be like, I have the software skills, I can focus on that thing. Or nuclear, or they're a biologist and they care about bio risks right now. So for most people, they wouldn't be focused on the abstract category of X risk. Like that's mostly people who are kind of philosophers who like to category theory and like abstractions of that type combined with thinking about social system design and whatever. And so some people should. And then there's also a lot of like, before we started talking about X risk and catastrophic risk, we were talking about that there's extreme poverty in the world and there's still fucked up wars and warlords, and there's rampant torture in the world. I was just talking to a woman who runs one of the biggest organizations that works on torture, and she's like, the torture today is mostly hidden, but because of population, it is way worse than it was in the Dark Ages, like the total global torture happening. And so a lot of people's Dharma should be working on those things. A lot of other people's Dharma should be creating beautiful art and beautiful sci-fi and whatever about a future that is desirable, that could be as an attractor for where people can go. A lot of people's work should be developing psychotherapeutic capacities to help people who are working on these topics. So one thing is, don't assume that the topic that seems like the most urgent one is the one everyone should be focused on, because that is itself myopic, right? All the things need done. One way of talking about what do we need to do is a world where everyone is doing their Dharma. If everyone is doing what is actually theirs to do, that maps to what needs done is happening. So one thing I would think about the Stoa doing is not just assume that people should be working in a particular space just because they're interested in it, because they might not have had support finding what is actually a better calling for them. And so then what is the right psychotherapeutic and cognitive and professional and relational support for them in the domain they should actually be in? That's one topic. And then in terms of things like, for people who are working either in X risk as an abstracted category or domains of it, or even torture issues, like all of those have in common facing issues that are too big for an individual person to take responsibility for, hopefully motivated by compassion and love. And there's like a crushing emotional effect of just staring into it. So it doesn't have to be X risk. It's just really trying to solve anything that's huge and really matters. Where is there, like, can we create a space where people can process what is most alive for them? That is their overwhelm, their existential angst, their devastation, their fear of death, whatever. Process it in a way that doesn't have them have to just pretend, but also doesn't have them get stuck, and get support moving through it. Can we work on developing a group of practitioners that are really good at some of those things, and a group of practices that are really helpful? I think things like death work, where people actually create peace around the topic of death, is pretty upstream from a lot of it. Actually, Peter, I have a friend named Anne-Marie Keppel, who I think should come on and talk about that, who does exceptionally good work in that space. I think getting something like Byron Katie's The Work, and there's a couple refinements on it that you can make. I would be happy to suggest the refinements. and being able to have a tool like that that becomes kind of a community well-known practice on how to be able to separate what's objectively happening from the meaning making that's affecting how we're holding it, and do a better job working with our own meaning making. I think you guys had Alanya Forsberg on. She developed a process, she refined a process from the psychodrama tradition that she calls the golden bowl, that is maybe the most sophisticated, nuanced process I've ever seen for giving people feedback about their blind spots in small groups in a way that they can actually really hear. It's given in a way that is both very direct and also very loving. And yeah, I just think it's a really beautiful process to do that, and where people could come together either here or with their own groups of 5 people or 6 people that they're close to, and be able to have something like every month we're doing this thing. There's something about feedback like that that also has continuity with the same people over time, because then you can see, is someone actually taking the feedback, taking responsibility and changing it or not? Because if people give me feedback and I'm like, oh yeah, wonderful, thank you, and then next month I'm still doing it, next month I'm doing it, next month I'm doing it, I might just be full of shit and not like taking it seriously. And so it's helpful to be able to have continuity in practice of that kind. So yeah, these are a couple initial ideas, but my bigger recommendation is there are probably a lot of people. I mean, Skylar does great psychotherapeutic work with people. There are lots of people in this community that do get some design sessions together. Also, get people like the gentleman who was talking earlier from the EA and X-risk communities to share what they observed. They'll go much deeper than what I just did and say, like, here's what I experienced myself, here's what I observed, these are the problems. So you get a map of what would actually use support that is grounded in terms of what's happening in the space.
It's a great response. Thank you. Fantastic.
Awesome. Yeah, we gotta get some people doing some golden bowl here at the Stoa. Last question, perhaps Jeff D. Jeff D has a really cool blog called Doomsday Parenting, and his question is related.
Cool.
Hi, Daniel. So, I mean, I think it seems to me that, like, if you're a parent, you're in the X-risk business, kind of automatically.
You're a thoughtful one.
And yet, yeah, well, and yet I'm finding that it's difficult to get parents to really talk about this stuff, or talk about, it's touchy to talk about parenting at all with other parents. So, you know, I was just wondering if you had any ideas around, you know, how do you properly raise children without either lying to them, you know, by shielding the worst realities from them, which they kind of deserve, or passing along unfair, you know, world-saving expectations, because that's also unfair. Or am I missing something? Is there some way to surf in between those?
I'm not a parent. I don't have the answer to this. I have a few thoughts, but they're obviously not tested. I might totally psychologically ruin my kids. I think I wouldn't, but who knows? There's, I don't know if you ever had a woman named Miriam on who does parenting work with people. You have? I would ask her that question. I really love the way that she thinks about the process of being honest with kids and also developmental appropriateness. Shelley Lefko also would be really quite good. She does brilliant parenting work that addresses similar topics, and specifically the method that her husband developed is kind of like a more sophisticated version of the work in terms of a cognitive behavioral shift process. But so she took it into parenting to say, how do we raise kids without dysfunctional beliefs in the first place? But not just what do we think is a good belief, but how do we raise them to have awareness and agency in their own belief formation process? Those would both be good, interesting ones. And given what you're doing, Jeff, probably good friends to have. I do think there's something about developmental appropriateness of what is someone exposed to relative to the capacities and agency that their nervous system has at the time. A little kid who, if their parents weren't there, wouldn't survive. They would definitely die without their parents, is not actually an autonomous being yet, right? It's not a agentic being, it's a dependent thing. And so exposing them to big issues in the world when they can't even take care of themselves probably just creates a kid that is mostly terrified and hypervigilant forever, rather than prepares them properly. At the same time, having them be in a complete bubble and then see the world where they have such a stark break is a challenging thing. So there's a titration, there's a developmental, to what level do I expose them? And I think Zach Stein would also have very good things to say about that from a kind of neo-Piagetian developmental psych perspective, in terms of how do we expose things that upregulate their capacity in a way that is relevant, that is related to the upregulation capacity they actually have. Something like, if you're in the gym, there's a kind of pain that's good and a kind of pain that's bad. The kind of pain that is muscle soreness is good. The kind of pain that is like joint injury is bad. So it's, is this a thing that I actually, is it a stress that I can upregulate in response to, or is this a stress that something is just going to get broken in response to? Is a very deep question for everybody, honestly, but particularly for kids. So I would mostly defer this question further to the people that I think know it better than I do.
Thanks. Yeah, I think there's something about the high end of that spectrum where it's like there's always been a question around how do you explain to a child what the dangers are in life. It just seems like this particular set of dangers is novel, and I think this is where the conversation hasn't been robust enough in parenting. But I appreciate your thoughts and sources.
I will say one thing on it is that I think what parents demonstrate is much more important than what they overtly say. And this is why being a parent is actually a forcing function for doing your own developmental work if you don't want to pass your shit on to your kids. And so a parent that is engaged in challenges of the world, the kid gets to see, oh, this, like when you're walking with them, do you pick up the trash? When you're walking with them, how do you respond to the homeless people and the people that look upset? How, like, do they get to see, not you telling them something, but do they get to see an embodiment of compassion, care, responsibility, you know, those ethics? And then what is your work? Is it, oh, another fucking day at the job, can't wait for the weekend? Or is it someone who is on fire to do meaningful things? And then if they see that you're addressing real issues in the world with passion, but you also feel empowered, and what they're learning is your emotional state of empowerment, as opposed to either apathy or overwhelm or anger or frustration. They should also see you have emotions, right? They should see you sometimes feel sad or frustrated, but process it responsibly. So they aren't learning to be sociopathic. They aren't learning to hide and then break and commit suicide. They're learning that to have healthy emotional processes and process them in functional ways that lead to being able to stay connected to their values, compassionate and empowered simultaneously. And that dialectic of what you could call feminine and masculine qualities, if you want, or whatever, of compassionate, sensitive, caring, attuned, and strong, resilient, empowered, that those are always coupled. And so I would say you can tell them that, but mostly you have to demonstrate it, and they will get that by osmosis, but in the demonstration of it.
No, that's great. And good job for not being a parent.
For what? For not being a parent?
Even though you're not a parent. Yeah.
Awesome. So we're close to the bottom of the hour, and we have a fun event coming up soon. So Daniel, any closing thoughts you'd like to leave us with here at the Stoa today?
I hope this has been interesting and useful. And I know probably every time somebody talks, you guys have a whole thought of what the Stoa community could do to advance that topic. And there's probably a backlog that is bigger than the organizational capacity and people's time to respond to all of it. If it happens that those parenting topics increase, I'll be happy. I think those are super important. If it happens that the death topics get worked on, I think that would be great. If it happens that how do we help people, not X-Risk in particular, how do we help everybody in here find their own Dharma better? And then how do we help them with the resources, relational, cognitive, professional, psychological, to do better in that Dharma? That would be an amazing fucking thing, right? For a community to be able to help people both find their path and walk their path better. And I think this is already oriented that way, but the idea of that as a kind of like central design intention to keep developing and to create better collective intelligence process where anybody who has good things to offer to that can, and they can be harvested somehow. Obviously, that doesn't look like something that Peter can synthesize all that shit and run it himself, that, you know, and especially on largely volunteer basis. So I'm not sure where that goes, but whatever way it could go, I would love to see that.
Beautiful. Yeah. I just feel excitement in my body. The session, a lot of aliveness. I can tell in the chat in the room as well. So yeah, I'll make some closing announcements in a moment. But Daniel, thanks so much for coming to Stoa today. Beautiful session, and yeah, I'll plug a few events that are related to what was spoken about today. Skylar Brown is having a session called Coming Home, and Skylar has done embodiment work with both Daniel and I and many others. So Skylar, perhaps if you can give us a preview of what that's about.
Oh, on the spot. Yeah, we'll just we'll spend some time talking about embodiment, but my intention is always to bring us into a state of embodiment. So we'll do some practice and maybe some breakout groups. We'll see how long the session is, but definitely Q&A and yeah, just some techniques and practical ways to be more embodied.
And that is July 21st at 12 p.m. Eastern time. We have a few other sessions on embodiment too. You can check out the website. And we have an event coming up in a minute. Taschen Fogelman has a session called Weird Metta. Metta meaning loving kindness meditation. It's a 3-part series. Taschen, could you plug that event if you're here?
Yeah, sure. Hi. We'll be doing some metta practice for 3 days in a row. Hope you can come to all of them. I'll be teaching loving kindness practice with a little bit of a different style, hence Weird Metta, and it'll be culminating with a dance party on Friday. So please come and dance and practice metta while dancing. Would love to see you all there.
Thank you, Taschen. This is more like about experimenting at the Stoa with different psychotechnology, which is related to what we spoke about today. So that being said, Daniel, everyone, thank you so much for coming to the Stoa today. Hope to see you on the next link.